Hi there, I'm Professor McDonald with the Environmental Science Department, and I'm standing in the middle of a 30-acre tract of forest and farmland that we have access to in the town of Southwick. And I'm just going to take a little walk through this patch of woods and out into the cornfield and show you a little bit of the opportunities our students have to come out and do some field research and monitoring and get exposed to some of the different habitats and cover types around here in southern New England. So I'm going to switch this around, put it on my head, and we'll take a little bit of a walk on a fall day. There. I'm sorry for that upside down part, but I wanted to be able to walk and talk at the same time. And so this parcel came to us through the donation from the family of a recent graduate. The parcel was then sold to an abutting landowner, and the landowner has given us access to the property for educational purposes, and we've already been making some use of it over the last year. One of the things on this property that was of interest to us was on top of this little ridge we're on, an old fire pond that had been dug in. And so we'll walk right down through this. This functions as a vernal pool here on top of the ridge, and there are some natural wetlands at the bottom of the ridge and adjacent to the cornfield. But this one had breeding salamanders, frogs, and toads in it last spring. We had students who did a senior research project tracking the water temperature and activity levels of amphibians using temperature probes in the pond, and then some automatic recording devices where we were trying to look at the timing and intensity of use by frogs and toads when they came up here to breed in the springtime. So this fire pond has been here probably for over a century. It's already ringed in with both natural vegetation and some invasive species, but functions pretty well as a vernal pool. Here we are, it's the first week of October. As you know, it's been a relatively dry summer, and the pond has shrunk to just a small puddle in the middle. But that's really what vernal pools do. They're not supposed to hold water all year long. They're supposed to hold water in the spring, and usually then again in the fall and maybe over winter, but then potentially dry up in the summer. And one of the key features of a vernal pool is that there aren't any fish in it. So fish would eat the frogs and the salamander eggs and things like that. And this one has been functioning probably for a very long time as a useful vernal pool here in the forest. We caught a few salamanders that were migrating in to lay their eggs this spring. We might have gotten in a little bit late and missed kind of the peak of salamander activity, but we had plenty of wood frogs and American toads as well. Now we'll walk down through the forest into the cornfield. Unfortunately, like a lot of southern New England, this woodlot has a whole bunch of invasive species. These multiflora rose that are ringing the pond. There are a few other species that we'll encounter as we walk down through. Some Japanese barberry and some bittersweet vines. But there's also native vegetation, mountain laurel, common juniper, things that you'd expect to find in a piece of woods that is reclaiming an old field. Mature oak trees. So this is kind of the typical southern New England mixed oak forest. We have some red oaks, some white oaks, red maples, some big white pines that grew in when this was abandoned after being a pasture so many years ago. But we're going to start walking down the slope. We had a little bit of a drizzle just before I got here, and so there's sometimes when the wind blows, there's a trickle from the canopy. Here's some of the bittersweet. This is a really common invasive species in southern New England. It's the vine that climbs up a lot of trees and roadsides and woodlots. It gets really attractive bright orange berries this time of year. So as they ripen, they go from a yellow to orange to even a red. but spreads pretty quickly as birds take the seeds and move them around, as people take the vines and use them as wreaths in the fall, and then discard them in their backyards or in the woods around their house. They're native vines. This is a grapevine stretching up into the canopy of these trees. Grapevines use their surrounding vegetation as structure to reach the canopy, and they provide a pretty useful wildlife food in the fall. There was a branch falling out. Glad it was over there. Here's another one of the common invasives. This is Japanese barberry. There are other specimens in here that have the actual berries on them this time of year. Got to be kind of careful, because mixed in with all of this ground level vegetation is a healthy dose of poison ivy. And so I'm not usually susceptible to getting the poison ivy rash, but I don't like to tempt that fate either. More barberry and bittersweet. More multiflora rose. We're gonna walk through as best we can. Down at the base of the ridge, there's this little stream. It's kind of an intermittent stream. When there's high water, this will be flowing. But even this time of year, and even in the middle of the summer, it stayed fairly damp down here. Here's a good example of the poison ivy, or one example of it anyway, growing right in the bottom of this little brook. So shiny, three-leaved stems. Poison ivy can have a lot of different growth forms. It can be a vine climbing up the trees. That's probably the most common form that people know. It can form a really dense ground layer like an ivy, like the classic English ivy. But it can also have kind of a bush form where it grows up and looks like a tree sapling. And that one is the one that probably fools most people into touching it. So nice little open wetland spots. In a normal year with average rain, this would probably stay really wet all year long. This year, most of the running water has ceased to flow, but it's still a damp, shady spot all summer long, providing some thermal cover for wildlife species. And we've got kind of a classic southern New England wooded wetland here with a lot of swamp red maples. I mean, a few other species growing in amongst them. But red maple, these trees growing around me are all red maples. And they're really a ubiquitous species in our New England forests, and they can tolerate a whole variety of site conditions. So they can grow in these wetland areas, and there's even a variety that has been termed swamp red maple. So it's not a distinct species, but it's a local variant that can grow in really wet conditions. But red maple can be found all over our eastern forests, including on the driest ridgetop sites. So it's one of those things that is really expanded its distribution over the last century. This species in front of us is another one that used to be pretty widely distributed, is an American elm. They grow often in these wetter spots and used to be a fairly common street tree in the eastern part of the United States, and a significant component of our eastern forests as well, and were affected by the introduced Dutch elm disease and relegated to a much smaller distribution, and now they only occur in minor abundance in the forest as the Dutch elm disease really knocked them back. Here's the barberry with the red berries on it. And again, these are not edible for people, but birds and small mammals do find them attractive, and they persist on the plants all winter long, so they can be a winter food source for the non-migratory birds that spend the winter here with us. Walk around the swamp and then come out into the cornfield. The corn was just cut. This is an area where we'll be bringing students to look at these different natural community types, and then to talk about the effects of, you know, historic land use on forested sites, what we think of as natural forests now. Many of these were cleared for agriculture sometime over the last couple hundred years. That slope where we were with the fire pond was pastured at one point in time, and the fire pond probably also served as a watering source for livestock, but now it's been reclaimed by the forest. But the legacy of that land use still has an influence on the vegetation we see today. As we walk through the edge of the forest, again, a lot of invasive species forming kind of a dense tangle as we get closer to the edge of the cornfield where the sun is, where they get more sunlight. There were species of trees that were planted by one of the previous landowners, and so the edge of this field is lined with black walnut trees, which didn't really produce many nuts this year. Last year was a fairly abundant walnut crop. We'll walk out into the corn, was just harvested. And so black walnuts are a pretty valuable wildlife food for the species that, particularly of mammals, that can crack through the shells. So most often it's going to be squirrels that have a field day harvesting and eating the black walnuts. They also can be a valuable timber species. The wood of black walnut is very valuable when the trees have good growth form. Now these have been growing on the edge of this field and they've not been tended, so their form is fairly poor. So from a lumber standpoint, they don't have a lot of value. You can see they have a lot of branches low to the ground, a lot of forks. If somebody was growing these for the lumber value, they would have come through and pruned them a little bit and probably planted them maybe a little denser spacing. But for the purposes of establishing them as a wildlife food crop, they've done really well. This cornfield makes up about half of the property, so the whole property is a little over 30 acres. This cornfield is about 15 acres. And talking with some of the folks involved with the farm who lease it and plant and harvest the corn, it's been in some kind of row crop agriculture for well over 100 years. And you can see even after 100 years of being plowed, or more than 100 years of being plowed, there's still plenty of nice stones that come up through to the surface. Reminds me of my garden. I have plenty of rocks in the garden. But this soil has been affected by humans, you know, for well over 100 years through this intensive row crop agriculture. Housing has developed around us, so we're kind of a bit of an island of open space just south of Route 57 in Southwick. And the property is ringed with more wetlands. So we have this little high spot that has been in agriculture, but surrounding us are forested wetlands and some open wetlands and persistent ponds. And so all of these things provide useful habitat for a variety of wildlife species, both vertebrates and invertebrates, terrestrial and aquatic, migratory and resident species will stop here. And it gives us a really good spot to come with students and do a variety of sampling techniques for both plants and animals and soils to illustrate how scientists do their work in the field, whether they're wetland scientists or wildlife scientists like I am, or restoration ecologists or soil scientists. There's plenty of opportunity here to demonstrate all of the techniques that we would employ in our professions and give the students a chance to develop their own monitoring projects for their senior research or independent studies that they may want to do. And then for other classes, like one we teach to first-year students, natural history and field techniques, it gives us a chance to show some species of trees and plants that we may not encounter closer to campus, or to see them growing in a different environment, like these black locusts that are growing along the edge of this forest compared to the black walnuts that are growing on the other edge of the field. So it's quite a neat sight and a great opportunity for us to be able to come here at different times of the year and do different sampling procedures with our students, whether they're passive, if we were just coming out to listen for birds or amphibians, or more active, if we were going to sample plants and soils or set up some trapping operations to catch the salamanders or small mammals. There's a whole range of activities we can do on this one relatively discrete site that's close to campus, so it's fairly accessible for students, whether they have a vehicle or need a ride with other students or with our vans. So I'm glad I had a chance to show off this property that we've got the access to because of a couple of good friends of the department and generous donors. And it's a beautiful fall day to be taking a walk in our New England woods.